The sun cast long shadows across the polished floor of the hotel suite as Keanu Reeves gazed out at the Los Angeles skyline. He ran his hand through his slightly graying hair and took a deep breath. At 59, his face carried more lines than when he'd first become famous, but his eyes still held that same thoughtful intensity that had captivated audiences for decades. 10 minutes, Mr. Reeves, called a production assistant from the doorway. Keanu nodded and turned away from the window. He wasn't particularly fond of interviews, never had been. But this one felt different somehow. After nearly 40 years in the spotlight, he'd grown increasingly aware of the unspoken rules that governed Hollywood, the things you could say and the many more things you couldn't. The interview had been arranged to promote his latest film, an indie drama that had already generated award buzz at early screenings. But in the quiet moments before the cameras rolled, Keanu found himself thinking about more than just the typical promotional talking points. Lisa Chen, the interviewer from Cultural Discourse, had a reputation for conversations that went beyond the surface. Her previous celebrity profiles had revealed unexpected depths in their subjects. Perhaps that's why Keanu had agreed to this particular interview when he'd declined so many others. As he settled into the chair across from Lisa, the production team bustled around them, adjusting lights and checking sound levels. "All set?" Lisa asked, her notepad resting on her lap. Unlike many modern journalists, she still jotted notes by hand, believing it created a more genuine connection. "As ready as I'll ever be," Keanu replied with a small smile. The first 15 minutes progressed as expected. Questions about the new film, about working with the director, about what had drawn him to the role. Of a former astronaut grappling with his return to Earth, Keanu answered thoughtfully, but stayed within the familiar boundaries of film. Promotion. Then Lisa shifted gears. "Throughout your career, you've often chosen roles and projects that seem to defy industry expectations," she said. "What guides those choices when the safer path might be more commercially advantageous?" Something in her phrasing caught Keanu's attention. He paused, considering the question more deeply than the typical interview query. "You know, I've been thinking about this a lot lately," he said, his voice growing quieter, more deliberate. The camera operator adjusted slightly to capture his expression as he leaned forward. "There's always been this pressure in our industry to fit certain molds, to make choices that maximize profit rather than meaning." He glanced briefly at his publicist, who stood off camera, her expression neutral but watchful. "I guess I've just always felt that following someone else's roadmap for your life is a kind of slow death," Keanu continued, "even when the intentions behind that guidance aren't bad exactly." Lisa nodded, sensing they were entering territory beyond the usual promotional interview. "Was there a specific moment when you realized you needed to chart your own path?" Keanu's eyes crinkled slightly as he thought back. "It wasn't one big moment. It was hundreds of small ones. Early in my career, I was told I needed to change my name, that Keanu was too unusual, that audiences wouldn't connect with it." He gave a soft laugh. "Can you imagine? What kept you from following that advice?" Something inside just said no. "It was my grandfather's name. It means cool breeze over the mountains in Hawaiian. It was me." He made a simple gesture with his hands. "And once you start letting others define who you are, where does it end?" As the interview continued, Keanu began speaking with increasing openness about the various crossroads in his career. The projects he'd chosen despite warnings they would fail. The franchise opportunities he'd walked away from when he felt the story had run its course. "The most dangerous control isn't the obvious kind," he said, now fully engaged in the conversation, seemingly forgotten about the cameras. "It's the subtle pressure to make choices out of fear. Fear of irrelevance, fear of missing out, fear of offending the wrong people." Lisa leaned forward. "And how do you resist those pressures?" Keanu was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that seemed to hush the entire room. "By remembering what matters. I've been fortunate enough to experience real loss in my life." His eyes reflected pain that, despite decades, had never fully healed. And nothing clarifies what's important like losing people you love. Success, fame, being liked by everyone. These things seem small when measured against the real stuff of life. The publicist checked her watch, signaling they should wrap up, but Keanu continued. "Look, I'm not saying I have all the answers. Far from it. But I've learned that the moments I regret aren't the times I failed while trying something meaningful. They're the times I stayed quiet when I should have spoken, or when I let someone else's vision override what I knew was right for me." Lisa sensed they were touching on something powerful. "Do you think the control in Hollywood has gotten worse over the years?" Keanu considered this carefully. "I think the methods have gotten more sophisticated. Social media, analytics, the constant measurement of what works and what doesn't. It creates this illusion that there's a formula for everything, including how to be a person in the public eye." He shook his head slightly. "But humans aren't algorithms. The most meaningful connections happen when we're authentic, not when we're optimized." The camera operator glanced at the director, both sensing they were capturing something rare, a genuine, unscripted moment of reflection from one of Hollywood's most private stars. "Any advice for younger actors or really anyone feeling these same pressures?" Lisa asked. Keanu smiled, the warmth reaching his eyes. "Question the rules that don't make sense to you. Ask yourself who benefits from your compliance. Find people who value your authentic self, not just what you can do for them." He paused, looking briefly at his hands before meeting Lisa's eyes again. "And remember that the most powerful thing you possess is your attention. Where you place it determines what grows in your life. If you focus only on pleasing others or meeting external standards, that's the garden you'll cultivate." As the interview concluded, the room remained unusually quiet. The typical post-interview chatter was subdued, as if everyone present knew they'd witnessed something out of the ordinary. Lisa thanked him as the sound technician removed his microphone. "Hope I didn't go too far off topic," Keanu said with a small, almost apologetic smile. "Not at all," Lisa replied. "I think you just gave us something real." Later that evening, as the production team reviewed the footage, they knew immediately that this wasn't just another celebrity interview. There was a rawness to it, a humanity that cut through the polished veneer of typical Hollywood conversations. "Should we edit down some of the philosophical stuff?" asked one of the junior producers. "Get back to the film promotion?" The senior producer watched the screen, where Keanu's face was frozen in a moment of genuine reflection. "No," she said finally. "This is what people are hungry for. Something true." Within hours of the interview airing, clips began circulating online. Comments poured in from viewers who felt moved by Keanu's words, who saw in his reflections their own struggles with authenticity in a world full of pressure to conform. "Never expected Keanu Reeves to be the one to put into words what I've been feeling my whole career," wrote a well-known musician. "This isn't about Hollywood, it's about all of us," commented another viewer. As night fell over Los Angeles, Keanu sat in the quiet of his home, unaware that his words were already reaching millions. He hadn't planned to speak so openly. Yet somehow, in that hotel room, it had felt like the right moment to share the hard-won wisdom of his years. Perhaps tomorrow he would worry about the reaction. But tonight, there was a certain peace in knowing he had spoken his truth. By the following morning, Keanu's interview had taken on a life of its own. What began as a standard promotional conversation had transformed into something people couldn't stop talking about. Snippets of his words about personal autonomy and resisting pressure appeared everywhere online, shared by everyone from teenagers to business executives. Keanu woke to his phone buzzing repeatedly with notifications. He typically kept his distance from social media, preferring the quiet simplicity of life away from constant digital connection. But his longtime friend and assistant Miguel had already called twice. "Have you seen what's happening online?" Miguel asked when Keanu finally answered. "No," Keanu said, his voice still rough with sleep. "Is something wrong with the interview?" Miguel laughed. "Wrong? It's everywhere. People are calling it the most honest thing to come out of Hollywood in years." Keanu sat up in bed, running a hand through his sleep-tousled hair. "I just answered her questions." "Well, your answers hit a nerve." "In a good way." After brewing coffee, Keanu reluctantly opened his laptop. He rarely checked his own press, finding it an easy way to lose touch with reality. But curiosity won out this time. The main entertainment sites all featured headlines about his interview. "Keanu Reeves gets real about industry pressure, a kind of slow death. The philosophy of freedom, Keanu speaks out." Why Keanu Reeves's honest interview is breaking the internet. But it wasn't just entertainment media. Business publications, psychology websites, and even political commentators were sharing his words. A short clip where he spoke about questioning rules that don't make sense had been viewed over 12 million times already. His phone rang again. This time it was his agent, David. "So," David began, "this wasn't exactly the promotional angle we discussed." Keanu sipped his coffee. "I know, it just happened." "Well, it's happening in a big way. I've had calls from 3 major networks wanting follow-up interviews. The studio behind your new film is thrilled with the attention, but a bit concerned about the message overshadowing the movie itself." "What do they want me to do?" Keanu asked, already sensing the answer. "They're suggesting a few clarifying statements. Nothing major, just to redirect focus to the film." Keanu gazed out his window at the morning sun casting long shadows across his garden. The irony wasn't lost on him, being asked to walk back statements about not letting others control his voice. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Throughout the day, the phenomenon only grew. People began sharing their own stories of times they'd resisted external pressure, tagging them with "Don't let them control you." Artists, teachers, healthcare workers, people from all walks of life connected with the message. A popular podcast host spliced Keanu's words with music, creating a short motivational video that racked up views in the millions. Memes featuring his face and quotes spread rapidly, some accurate, others taking creative liberties with what he'd actually said. By afternoon, Keanu received a text from Lisa Chen, the interviewer. "Did we just accidentally start a movement?" He smiled at that. The idea that his impromptu reflections could spark something larger felt both strange and somehow right. For decades, he'd tried to navigate fame while staying true to himself. Perhaps others were hungry for permission to do the same. Around 4 o'clock, he received another call, this one from Thomas Wright, the director of his upcoming film. "Keanu, my friend," Thomas began warmly. "Quite the stir you've caused." "Seems that way," Keanu replied. "Hope it hasn't created problems for you." "Are you kidding? The film's visibility has quadrupled overnight." "But that's not why I'm calling." Thomas paused. "I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For being real. I've been in this business 30 years and I've watched good people twist themselves into knots trying to be what everyone else wants." What you said needed saying. The conversation with Thomas lifted Keanu's spirits, but not everyone was as supportive. By evening, he'd received thinly veiled warnings from 2 major studios where he had potential projects in development. Their messages came wrapped in concern and friendly advice, but the subtext was clear. Controversial voices could become liability risks. One executive wrote, "In today's climate, we just want to make sure our creative partners understand the importance of staying above the fray." The phrase stuck with Keanu, above the fray. As if speaking, honestly, about personal freedom was somehow getting down in the mud. As night fell, he found himself sitting in his home studio, a space where he often went to think. The walls were lined with books and mementos from his life and career. A guitar rested in the corner. He wasn't particularly good, but he found playing calming. His phone continued buzzing with messages and calls, but he'd silenced it hours ago. Instead, he picked up a leather-bound journal and began writing his thoughts. Not for public consumption, but to clarify his own mind. He wrote about the strange feeling of seeing his words take on meaning for others, about the subtle pressures already mounting to soften his message, about his own uncertainty regarding what to do next. Was this moment worth fighting for? Or should he do as suggested, issue a clarifying statement, redirect attention to the film, and let the conversation die down? The question kept him up past midnight. Finally, unable to sleep, he sent a message to an old friend who had walked away from a successful acting career years ago to become a professor at a small college. "When you left the industry," Keanu wrote, "did you ever regret speaking out about why?" The reply came surprisingly quickly. "Only on days when I wanted to be liked more than I wanted to be honest." "Those days get fewer as you get older." Keanu smiled at that. It echoed something his mother had told him when he was young. The truth doesn't stop being true just because it makes people uncomfortable. By morning, the online conversation had evolved. Commentators debated whether Keanu's words represented a genuine stance or a calculated publicity move. Some defended him passionately. Others suggested he was naive about how the world really worked. A message from his publicist contained links to several opinion pieces, some supportive, others critical. We should get ahead of this narrative, she advised. I've drafted a statement that acknowledges the conversation while gently redirecting to the film. The attached statement was skillfully written. It thanked people for connecting with his words while subtly walking back any suggestion that he was criticizing the industry that had given him so much. Keanu read it twice. It was perfectly reasonable, perfectly safe, and completely contrary to everything he'd just said about not letting others control your voice. He placed his phone on the coffee table and walked to the window. Outside, the world continued as normal. People walking dogs, delivery trucks making their rounds, life unfolding in its ordinary way. Yet online, his words were still sparking conversations about authenticity, freedom, and the courage to speak one's truth. Was it worth protecting future opportunities if it meant compromising the very message that had resonated with so many? His phone rang again, the studio executive this time. Keanu watched it buzz against the coffee table, making small circles on the glass surface. After the fifth ring, he reached for it, his decision made. Whatever came next, he would face it on his own terms. After all, what good was a voice if you only used it to echo what others wanted to hear? 3 days after the interview aired, Keanu still hadn't issued any clarifying statements. His silence made the industry executives increasingly nervous, but it gave him time to think. He needed that space, away from the noise, away from the pressure, away from the countless opinions about what he should do next. He decided to drive up the coast, something he often did when he needed clarity. The rhythm of the road and the endless horizon of the Pacific had a way of putting things in perspective. He loaded a small bag into his Porsche, told Miguel he'd be unreachable for a day or two, and headed north on Highway 1. The morning fog hugged the coastline as Keanu drove. His window cracked just enough to let in the salt air. The interview and its aftermath played in his mind on repeat. He wasn't used to being at the center of a cultural moment. His words had clearly touched something in people, a hunger for authenticity in a world that often rewarded conformity. By midday, he reached a small coastal town where he was less likely to be recognized. He checked into a modest inn under his usual pseudonym, parked his car in back, and walked to a quiet beach just as the fog was burning off. Sitting on a piece of driftwood, watching the waves, Keanu thought about the various crossroads in his career, the roles he'd taken despite warnings they would fail, the big-budget sequels he'd walked away from when the story no longer felt right, the times he'd reduced his own salary so other actors could be brought onto projects. None of those decisions had come without pressure. There had always been voices warning of consequences, of missed opportunities, of career suicide. Yet here he was, decades later, still working, still finding projects that mattered to him. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Despite his promise to disconnect, he'd kept it on in case of emergencies. The screen showed a text from Thomas, the director of his current film. Just heard from the studio. They're threatening to scale back the release unless you clarify your position. Whatever that means. No pressure from me either way. Your call. Keanu sighed and slipped the phone back into his pocket. The irony wasn't lost on him. The more people talked about not letting others control you, the more certain forces tried to regain that control. He walked along the shoreline, letting the cold water occasionally wash over his boots. An older couple passed by, giving him a curious second glance but continuing on their way. It was a small relief to be somewhere his face wasn't on everyone's phone screen. As the sun began to set, casting long golden light across the water, Keanu headed back to the inn. The small room was plain but comfortable, with a window overlooking a garden. He ordered a simple dinner and opened his laptop, finally ready to see the full scope of what had unfolded. The hashtag, "should not let them control." You had millions of posts across platforms. People were sharing stories of standing up to workplace pressure, leaving toxic relationships, pursuing creative passions despite discouragement. His words had become a permission slip for others to honor their own inner voice. But there was backlash too. Some industry commentators questioned whether Keanu understood the realities of the business. Others suggested he was having some kind of midlife crisis. A few even tried to connect his comments to fringe political movements, twisting his words about personal autonomy into something he never intended. Keanu closed the laptop and walked to the window. The garden below was peaceful in the fading light, the flowers closing up for the night. He thought about what was really at stake here. Not just a film release or future roles, but something more fundamental. The right to speak honestly after decades of careful diplomacy. His phone rang. This time it was Alan Reed, the head of the studio behind his current film. Keanu had known Alan for years, had worked on several projects with him. They weren't exactly friends, but there was mutual respect. "Keanu," Alan began, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a veteran executive. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Just watching the sunset," Keanu replied. "Look, I'll get right to it. We're in a bit of a situation with the film launch. Your interview has created, let's call it, an unexpected variable in our marketing strategy." "I answered a question honestly, Alan." "Of course you did. And nobody's questioning your right to speak your mind. But you have to understand, partners get nervous when talent goes off message, especially when that message could be interpreted as critical of industry practices." Keanu watched a hummingbird hover near a flower in the garden below. "I wasn't criticizing any specific company or person. Intent and perception are different animals in this business. You know that?" Alan paused. "We've got theater chains getting skittish, wondering if your comments are somehow directed at their business models. We've got investors calling, asking if there's some controversy they should know about." "There's no controversy. I talked about making choices based on personal values instead of fear. And that's a beautiful sentiment. Really, it is. But right now, we need to get this film in front of audiences. The film you put your heart into for 6 months. The film that 200 crew members worked on. People whose bonuses depend on box office performance." It was a subtle form of pressure, but effective, tying his decision to the livelihoods of others. Keanu had seen this tactic before. Make it about the team, the crew, the collective good. Make individual principles seem like selfish indulgence. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Keanu asked, though he already knew. "Just a simple statement, clarifying that your comments were philosophical in nature and not directed at any specific practices in the industry. Expressing gratitude for the opportunities you've had. That kind of thing. And if I don't feel that's necessary," there was a slight pause, "then we'd have to reevaluate our release strategy. Possibly scale back the theatrical run, focus more on streaming. It wouldn't be punitive, just risk management." After the call ended, Keanu sat in the growing darkness of the room. Alan's message had been delivered with friendly concern, but the ultimatum was clear. Walk back the comments or watch the film suffer. It wasn't just about this one project. The unspoken threat was about future opportunities, too. Hollywood had a long memory for those who didn't play by the rules. Keanu ordered a whiskey from room service and sat by the window, watching as garden lights came on, illuminating the paths between flower beds. He thought about the 200 crew members Alan had mentioned. He thought about his fellow actors in the film. He thought about Thomas, the director who had put years into getting the project made. Did he have the right to stand on principle if others would pay the price? But then wasn't that exactly how the system maintained control? By making sure every act of authenticity came with collective consequences? Around midnight, Keanu opened his laptop again and began typing. Not the statement the studio wanted, but something else entirely. A longer reflection on why authentic voice matters, on the subtle ways systems maintain control, on the price of speaking out and the greater price of staying silent. When he finished writing, he read it over once, then closed the laptop without sending it to anyone. He needed to sleep on it, to make sure this wasn't just reaction or emotion. In the morning, he walked along the beach again as the sun rose, casting pink light across the water. The clarity he sought had finally come, not as a flash of insight, but as a quiet certainty about what mattered most at this point in his life. He drove back to Los Angeles with the windows down, the coastal air filling the car. Whatever consequences came, he would face them on his own terms. By the time he reached his home, his decision was made. He wouldn't issue any clarifying statement. He wouldn't walk back his words. He wouldn't let the pressure, however nicely packaged, control his voice. Instead, he would do something else entirely. Something that would change the conversation in ways nobody, including the studio executives, would expect. The morning after his return to Los Angeles, Keanu called Thomas, the film's director. "Can we meet?" "Just the two of us," Keanu asked. "No agents, no studio people." They agreed to meet at Thomas's home in the hills, a modernist structure of glass and steel that somehow still felt warm and lived in. Thomas's dog, an old golden retriever named Charlie, greeted Keanu at the door with a wagging tail. "He remembers you from the set," Thomas said, leading Keanu to a back patio overlooking the canyon. "Coffee?" As Thomas poured 2 cups, Keanu explained the pressure he'd been receiving and his decision not to issue any clarifying statement. "I expected as much." Thomas nodded. "So what's your plan?" "That's why I'm here," Keanu said. "This isn't just my film. It's yours, your vision, your years of work. I need to know if you're okay with whatever happens next." Thomas leaned back in his chair. At 62, he'd seen plenty of industry politics and had the battle scars to prove it. "You know, when I was starting out, a veteran director told me something I never forgot. He said, 'In this business, you'll be asked to compromise 1,000 times. The trick is knowing which compromises kill your soul and which ones are just part of the dance." Thomas sipped his coffee. "I think you're facing one of those soul-killing compromises right now." Keanu felt relief wash over him. "So you understand?" "More than understand. I support it." Thomas set his cup down. "Look, they're threatening to scale back the release. So what, the film will find its audience? It always does. But your investors will get their money back, maybe with less profit. I can live with that," Thomas smiled. "What I couldn't live with is watching you cave just to protect the film. That would be a sad ending to this story, wouldn't it?" With Thomas's support secured, Keanu moved forward with his plan. Rather than issuing a statement through publicists or social media, he wrote a personal letter, not walking back his previous comments but expanding on them. He shared specific stories from his career where staying true to his values had cost him opportunities but preserved something more valuable. He arranged to have this letter published as an essay in a respected cultural magazine rather than through entertainment news channels. The piece was titled simply, "Why Authenticity Matters." In it, he wrote, "The most insidious control isn't force or threats. It's the voice that says your individual truth must always bow to collective comfort. That voice isn't protecting you, it's protecting systems that thrive on compliance." He also addressed the film directly. "To be clear, the people I've worked with on my current project are artists of integrity. This isn't about them. This is about broader patterns in how we're all encouraged to silence ourselves for convenience, for profit, for peace. I've done it too, more times than I can count. But at some point you have to ask, at what cost?" The magazine published the essay online on a Wednesday morning. By noon it had been shared hundreds of thousands of times. By evening it was the main topic on entertainment news. The studio executives were caught off guard. They'd expected either compliance or standard celebrity rebellion. This thoughtful, measured response wasn't in their crisis management playbook. What happened next surprised everyone, including Keanu. Actors, directors, and industry professionals began sharing their own stories of pressure and compromise. Some were veiled, naming no names. Others were specific, calling out practices that had long been accepted as just how things work. A well-known actress wrote about being told to lose weight for a role where her character was supposed to be a normal mother of 2. A director shared how he'd been forced to change an ending to make it more market-friendly for international audiences. A screenwriter detailed how her environmental message had been systematically diluted until it was meaningless. By standing firm in his own small way, Keanu had accidentally cracked open a door that many were eager to walk through. 4 days after the essay was published, something even more unexpected happened. Alan Reed, the studio executive who had pressured Keanu to walk back his comments, called personally. "I've been in this business 30 years, Alan said, his voice lacking its usual polish. "I thought I'd seen everything." "And now?" Keanu asked. "Now I'm wondering if I've been on the wrong side of something important." Alan paused. "The board met this morning. We're not scaling back the release when what changed? Public sentiment, for one thing. Turns out audiences respond pretty well to authenticity." "Who knew?" There was a touch of irony in Alan's voice. "But also, your essay made some of us uncomfortable in ways we needed to be." After the call, Keanu sat in his garden processing what had happened. He hadn't set out to create a movement or challenge an industry. He'd simply decided he couldn't agree to a compromise that felt wrong. The next day, Thomas called with more news. "The marketing team wants to lean into this whole authenticity angle now. They're talking about screening events where audience members can share their own stories of standing up for their values. Keanu laughed. So now my off-message moment is becoming the message? Welcome to Hollywood, Thomas said. But hey, at least it's a good message this time. In the following weeks, as the film's release approached, Keanu did select interviews, but on his own terms. He chose smaller outlets and thoughtful interviewers. He declined the major talk shows with their predictable questions and staged moments. One afternoon, he received a handwritten note from a lighting technician who had worked on the film. Just wanted to say thanks for standing up. I've been in this industry 20 years, always keeping my head down, always going along to get along. Watching you refuse to back down made me rethink some things. Yesterday I turned down a job on a project that goes against my values. Small thing maybe, but it felt big to me. Notes like this meant more to Keanu than any box office numbers. The idea that his small act of integrity had ripple effects for others was humbling. The film premiered at a theater in downtown Los Angeles. The red carpet was smaller than originally planned, with fewer entertainment reporters and more film journalists interested in the craft itself. Keanu wore a simple black suit and arrived with little fanfare. As he walked the carpet, a reporter thrust a microphone toward him. "Any regrets about how things played out with your comments?" she asked. Keanu thought about the pressure, the stress, the uncertainty of those days after the interview. Then he thought about the conversations that had started, the stories people had shared, the small changes happening in corners of an industry resistant to change. "No," he said simply. "No regrets." Inside the theater, Keanu sat between Thomas and Miguel. As the lights dimmed and the film began to play, he felt a rare sense of peace. The film would succeed or fail on its own merits. His career would continue or transform in ways he couldn't predict. But in this moment, one thing was certain. The voice inside him, the one that had guided his choices for decades, sometimes at great cost, was quiet with approval. Not because he had won some industry battle, not because his film would be seen by more people, but because when it mattered, he had chosen not to let them control his voice. The audience responded to the film with a standing ovation. As Keanu stood on stage afterward with the cast and crew, he looked out at the faces looking back at him. Some famous, most not. All part of an industry that could be brutal and beautiful in equal measure. An industry that might, in small ways, begin to change if enough people decided their authentic voice mattered more than approval. As he left the theater that night, a young actor stopped him briefly. "I just want to say, your interview changed how I think about my career, about what success really means." Keanu smiled and placed a hand briefly on the young man's shoulder. "Just remember, your voice is the one thing they can never take unless you give it away." 6 months after the film's premiere, Keanu sat in a small cafe in New York's West Village. He was in town for a literary festival where, surprisingly, he had been invited to speak about his essay on authenticity. The piece had taken on a life far beyond what he'd intended, becoming required reading in film schools and business ethics courses. Snow fell softly outside, coating the city in pristine white. Inside, the cafe was warm and quiet, with just a few patrons tapping on laptops or reading books. Keanu had arrived early for his meeting, using the time to jot down thoughts in a worn leather journal. The bell above the door jingled as Lisa Chen walked in, unwrapping a scarf from around her neck. She spotted Keanu and smiled. The journalist whose interview had started this whole journey had become, if not exactly a friend, then a respected colleague in conversation. "Sorry I'm late," she said, sliding into the chair across from him. "Subway delays." "No problem," Keanu replied, closing his journal. "Thanks for making time." The server brought coffee and Lisa pulled out a small recorder. "Mind if I record?" "Not for publication, just so I don't miss anything." Keanu nodded and Lisa pressed the button. So 6 months later, "Did you ever imagine your comments would spark what some people are calling a mini revolution in Hollywood?" He laughed softly. "Hardly a revolution. More like a moment of collective honesty." "Still," Lisa continued, "things have changed. 3 major studios have revised their talent contracts to include stronger creative input protections. The Directors Guild is pushing back against market testing endings. And that new independent creators coalition you helped establish has over 2,000 members now." Keanu wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, feeling its warmth. Those are industry changes. Important ones. But what matters more to me are the personal stories. Like what? Like the costume designer who told me she finally spoke up about unsafe working conditions on set after 15 years of silence. Or the stunt coordinator who refused to cut corners even when producers pushed for a quicker schedule. Keanu paused. Those individual choices, that's where real change happens. Lisa nodded, making notes. Your film did well despite the studio's initial threats to scale back the release. It found its audience, Keanu said simply. Thomas deserves the credit for that. He made something honest. And your career? Any fallout? Keanu smiled. Some doors closed. Others opened. He didn't elaborate on the two major projects that had quietly dropped him after the controversy, nor on the independent filmmakers who had sought him out precisely because of his stance. Would you do it all again? Lisa asked. Knowing what would follow? Keanu looked out at the snow for a long moment before answering. You know, when I was younger, I thought success in this business meant never making waves. Being professional meant being agreeable. I spent a lot of years trying to stay in my lane. He turned back to Lisa. But at some point you realize your lane is just a box someone else built, and staying in it isn't professionalism. It's surrender. Their conversation continued for another hour, touching on the broader cultural impact of what had started as a simple interview response. What had resonated wasn't just Keanu's stance, but the way he had held it, without anger, without attacking others, simply claiming his right to speak his truth. As they were finishing their coffee, a young woman approached their table hesitantly. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said, but I just wanted to thank you, Mr. Reeves. Keanu looked up with a gentle smile. For what? Your words helped me make a really hard decision. She twisted a ring on her finger nervously. I'm a writer. I was offered a job on a show that, well, it portrayed people like my family in ways I found hurtful. The money was amazing. I almost said yes just because everyone told me that's how you get ahead. She took a deep breath. But then I remembered what you said about choices made from fear. So I turned it down and found a different project. Less money, but I can sleep at night. After she left, Lisa turned off her recorder. That happens a lot, doesn't it? Keanu nodded. More than I ever expected. When they parted ways outside the cafe, the snow was falling harder. Keanu pulled his coat tighter and decided to walk the 30 blocks to his hotel, needing time to think before his speaking engagement that evening. The city was transformed by snow, quieter and somehow more intimate. As he walked, Keanu reflected on the strange journey of the past 6 months. The industry panels he'd been invited to join, the young actors who sought his advice, the executives who avoided eye contact at industry events. He had never wanted to be the face of anything, let alone a movement for greater authenticity in a notoriously inauthentic business. Yet here he was about to speak to a packed auditorium on that very topic. His phone buzzed with a message from Thomas. Just got the green light for our next project. No compromises. They're letting us do it our way, Keanu smiled. Perhaps the most surprising outcome of the whole experience was that some industry powers had realized authenticity could be marketable. What began as a perceived liability had slowly transformed into an asset. Of course, not everyone had embraced the change. Just last week, a powerful producer had cornered Keanu at an event, voice low with practiced concern. You've made things harder for everyone, you know. All this talk about speaking your truth sounds good, but this is still a business. Keanu had just nodded. It is a business, but it's also art, and art dies without truth. As he approached his hotel, Keanu noticed a small bookstore on the corner. In the window was a display of books about film and creativity. Front and center was a new release titled, Authentic Voice: How Honesty is Changing Hollywood. He didn't need to go inside to know his interview was probably quoted. The moment had become bigger than him, which was exactly as it should be. The best movements grew beyond their catalysts. In his hotel room, Keanu reviewed his notes for the evening's talk. He'd been asked to speak about courage in creative industries, but that framing had never felt right to him. What he'd done hadn't required courage so much as a simple recognition of what mattered at this stage of his life. He crossed out courage in his notes and wrote clarity instead. That evening, the auditorium was filled beyond capacity. People stood along the walls and sat in the aisles. When Keanu walked onto the stage, the applause was warm and sustained. He waited for it to quiet before speaking. "I'm not here to tell you how to fight the system," he began, "or to suggest I've done anything particularly brave." He looked out at the sea of faces, many young, eager, taking notes or recording on phones. "I'm just here to suggest that the voice inside you, the one that sometimes whispers when something doesn't feel right, deserves your attention. That voice isn't just your conscience. It's your compass." For the next hour, he shared stories from his career, the compromises he regretted and the stands he was glad he'd taken. He talked about the cost of silence and the unexpected rewards of speaking up. Throughout, he emphasized that this wasn't about rebellion for its own sake, but about finding the line each person must draw for themselves. The pressure to conform doesn't always come as obvious control, he explained. Sometimes it comes wrapped in concern, in protection, in the language of team spirit or practical reality. The most effective control is the kind that makes you think silencing yourself was your own idea. After the talk, during the question and answer session, a film student asked, "How do you know when to push back and when to compromise?" Keanu considered this carefully. "I think you feel it. There's a difference between compromise that helps create something better and compromise that diminishes what matters most. One feels like collaboration. The other feels like surrender." Later that night, back in his hotel room, Keanu stood by the window watching the snow-covered city. 6 months ago, he couldn't have imagined standing on a stage talking about authenticity and inner voice. He'd simply answered a question honestly. Yet that one moment of honesty had created ripples he could never have planned. People finding courage in their own lives, small changes in industry practices, conversations that had been waiting to happen. In the end, that was the most powerful lesson of all. Not that systems can't control you unless you let them, though that was true, but that a single authentic voice, however quiet, can awaken others. Tomorrow he would fly back to Los Angeles and start work on the new project with Thomas. Life would go on, and eventually this moment would fade into memory. But something had shifted, not just in the industry but in Keanu himself. He had rediscovered what he'd always known but sometimes forgotten in the complex dance of career and public life. The truest power isn't found in controlling others or being controlled by them. It's found in the simple, revolutionary act of speaking your own truth.